Hi, and welcome to the Geopolitical Futures podcast. I'm Xander Snyder, and today I'm joined by Philip Orchard, an analyst here at Geopolitical Futures. And we're going to be talking to you a little bit more about North Korea, but specifically the degree of maneuverability that South Korea has both on the peninsula generally and within the U.S.-South Korean alliance. So let's start with the latter. Philip, today we saw some signs that South Korea and the U.S. are going to basically work to transfer command of joint wartime operational control from the U.S. to South Korea. What exactly does that mean, and what implications does that have?
Right. So this is this kind of weird legacy of the Korean War. Basically, ever since then, the United States has maintained wartime control over the South Korean military. Now, the reason for that is because there's thousands and thousands of U.S. troops on the peninsula. The two militaries are very integrated, and during a conflict, especially with North Korea, you would want there to be one person clearly calling the shots. Now, today, South Korea is this robust democratic country with a very robust economy and the ability to fund and develop a modern military. And as a result, over the past 2 decades, especially, it's become kind of a political issue in South Korea, especially in left-leaning circles. It's sort of seen as a form of neocolonialism, with the U.S. sort of, or the South Korea is seen as sort of a de facto colony, a Yankee colony, as Pyongyang often likes to tease them. And also there's sort of a line of thought, particularly among the left, that says that the permanent U.S. presence in South Korea and the control over the South Korean military is worsening the crisis with North Korea, making Pyongyang much more determined to build up their missile and nuclear capabilities, and that if the South Korea to U.S. alliance was weakened a little bit, or confined to contingencies such as a North Korean invasion or something, then Pyongyang would be much more likely to sort of chill out. And so as a result, you've repeatedly over the past couple decades, there's been pushes to return control, wartime control from the U.S. back to the South Korean government so that they could decide when to deploy, when to act, and so forth. Now, that sounds good, or it makes sense on the surface, but it falls apart in a couple ways. And as a result, every time that there's an agreement with the U.S. to sort of to go through this process, it's known as to return what's called OPCON, operational control, back to the South Koreans. They always sort of set like a 5-year deadline, and then 4 years in, they kind of, well, okay, let's do it 5 years later. And that's happened repeatedly, most recently being in 2014. This OPCON was supposed to be transferred back to South Korea in 2015, and in 2014, the conservative government in Seoul kicked the can down the road again into the 2020s. And there's a couple reasons for that, but the main one is that there's this sort of fear that if you do this, it's sort of a slippery slope. Then maybe when the U.S. attention starts to stray, or U.S. needs to move resources elsewhere, the South Korean government would not be ready to stand on its own, or the South Korean military would not be ready to stand on its own. And that to mitigate that threat or that possibility, South Korea would have to spend tens and tens and tens of billions of dollars on upgrading its own capabilities. And the sort of second concern is that if the U.S. has less stake in the game, if the U.S. Is less invested into the security situation on the peninsula, then it may in fact be more likely to move on altogether, or to shrink its presence to a degree that leaves South Korea vulnerable. And in fact, that throughout since the mid 1970s, the U.S. has openly talked about making or trying to make South Korea shoulder a greater share of the defense burden, and maybe even pulling out altogether.
Now, we were chatting a little earlier, and you mentioned this parallel command structure that exists in the U.S.-Japan alliance. Now, it's not clear to me that with South Korea, the new OPCON would take some sort of similar parallel command structure like the U.S.-Japan alliance, or just be a transfer from a U.S. general currently, who would be in control in a wartime scenario, to a South Korean one. Do you have any sense what form this transfer would look like?
Right, and that's a good point, is that the U.S.-South Korean alliance is very unique. In most places where the U.S. has troops stationed, like Japan, it's a close cooperation, it's a close working relationship, but it's parallel command structures. And as I said, in South Korea, it's much more integrated, and it comes down to a single person calling the shots. Now, in a conflict, particularly something as complex as a conflict with North Korea, that makes a lot of sense to have one person calling the shots. There's a conflict with North Korea. It would require involve vast amounts of forces from both South Korea and the U.S., many of them working hand in hand. And it's hard to see how this would play out in a battlefield situation. And so that's yet to be something that has been worked out. There's various plans floating around about how this would look in practice, but it's not clear yet what the structure would look like. It can't work the way it does in Japan, because with U.S. and Japan are much less likely to be involved in a massive joint ground operation, like what may happen if war breaks out on the Korean Peninsula with the North. So that's an issue that has yet to be worked out, and we learned today, according to reports in Yonhap, that the United States and South Korea have agreed to set up a working group to hammer out these kind of issues. And one notable aspect of the report was that going forward, rather than setting a deadline like they have in the past for OPCON transfer, they are going to do it when the transfer will be done only when conditions are met, meaning only when South Korea feels ready. And so that basically means it could extend far, far into the future.
Yeah, it seems like problems can arise certainly in a wartime circumstance where you have, two people who are in control. Your point about Japan and the U.S. collaborating on a ground war, that being less probable, certainly makes sense. I can't help but imagine and this will seem a little off topic, so listeners forgive me for this, but the situation kind of reminds me a little bit of the command structure in the ancient Roman Republic. And the way it worked back then was you had two consuls that were elected at any given time for a period of a year. And the consul back in ancient Rome, the ancient Roman Republic at least, was essentially the executive office. So kind of like the president in the U.S., but obviously there were differences. Except you had two of them. And in a wartime situation, unlike today, the consuls both, would sit at the head of the army and actually lead them out into battle. And the consul would be also the head general. So you wonder, okay, but you have two consuls, they're equal in power. Was one greater than the other? And the answer is no. That was part of the way the balance of power was set up in the Republic. And the way that they traded power was essentially one consul would get to make all the shots decisively without challenge one day, and then power would just flip to the other consul the next day. And, it worked to a degree, right? Because Rome conquered the Mediterranean, and the Republic brought them to a point where they had sufficient hegemony to expand further north, but it also created or led to circumstances that you could say were really Rome's biggest military defeats ever. Like, I know the Battle of Cannae, which is iconic and I think one of the most interesting battles maybe in history. You had one consul advocating for one strategy, not just tactics, but one strategy of continuing to avoid Hannibal in the field because Hannibal had just been crushing the Romans. And then authority flipped over to the other consul who was, a little younger, trying to make his name for himself. And he said, you know what? We're going to do what Romans do, and we're just going to pile through the Carthaginian forces. I say we're going to lead an attack. And the other guy was kind of a little older, a little bit more seasoned, said that's not a great idea, but they did it. And Hannibal encircled the entire Roman army with a numerically inferior sized army and basically destroyed everyone. So obviously there are challenges to shared authority like that.
Right. Yeah. So be like the Romans, but not in that sense. That's what you're saying.
Yeah. Be like the Romans, but don't be like the Romans.
But don't be like the Romans. Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that brings up, in any conflict, even within, there's always going to be major disagreements about strategy. I mean, you saw that in World War I with the Germans, and war plans get thrown out the window routinely, and they're, you have to be able to adjust. And if there's the more dissonance you have in the senior levels, the harder it is to execute. And so it's hard to imagine, how that would work with two different countries having very at times divergent imperatives or interests in how the war plays out, or who's what to prioritize, what trade-offs to make, which whose troops to put in most immediate danger and so forth. So I think the bottom line is that that they have a lot of to do this. They have a lot of things to think through and a lot of things to work out, and in the current crisis, that means it's not going to happen quickly. So if for some reason that South Korea decided that they just could not bear to have the U.S. start a war with North Korea, which we've seen signs of, the transfer of operational control probably can't happen quickly enough and won't happen quickly enough to make an issue now. It's more of a long-term thing that they're thinking about.
Sure. So that's sort of one aspect of flexibility that we were going to talk about, of South Korea's flexibility in this circumstance. And the next that we were going to bring up was this conventional military threat that North Korea can pose to South Korea. And we wrote a little bit about this week in a reality check. So if you're interested in a little bit more detail than we'll be able to get into on this podcast, be sure to go check that out. But in the United States and to a certain degree in the Pacific Rim, but off of the Korean Peninsula, the focus of the Korean crisis has really been on North Korea's missile programs and their nuclear development, because the outstanding question is one, can North Korea currently deliver a nuclear weapon? And if not, when will they develop this capability? And that obviously makes sense because that's how a U.S. city, probably at first on the West Coast, is in greatest risk from North Korea, from any sort of crisis getting out of hand. However, South Korea is much closer. I know, deep insight there, right? And since the end of the Korean War, they have faced a conventional threat that North Korea cannot bring to bear against other nations. And this is strictly from their artillery force. And North Korea has a lot of both self-propelled and towed guns and howitzers. The best estimates that we've been able to come across are something like 21,000 guns, including mortars, in their arsenal in total. Now, these aren't all state-of-the-art new guns. A lot are very old. They acquired from the Soviet Union when the Soviet Union was its primary benefactor throughout the Cold War. There are indications that there's a fairly high dud rate. So, maybe 20% of the time when some of these guns try to fire, especially the older ones, either they won't work or the shells won't work. But the point is there's still a very large arsenal. And it's something that has been receiving an increasing degree of attention because...
What kind of damage could it do to Seoul then?
Yeah, that's ultimately the question, right? North Korea has threatened to destroy Seoul in a sea of fire and kill millions of people, and it's a pretty scary scenario. Now, Seoul lays far enough away from the demilitarized zone that there are only certain types of guns and rocket launchers in North Korea's arsenal that can actually reach it. And the best guess we have right now, or they basically have one type of artillery piece, which is a 170 millimeter koksang. I'm almost certainly mispronouncing that. And then they have two different caliber MRLs, is what they're called, multiple rocket launchers, 240 millimeters and 300 millimeters. Now, the koksang gun has a conventional range of about 25 miles, and that can be extended some if you use rocket-propelled ammunition. And the 240 and 300 millimeter MRLs have ranges of about 50 to 90 miles, respectively. So when you look at that, it actually decreases by a substantial portion the amount of guns in North Korea's arsenal that can actually hit Seoul. And it's the best estimates that we've been able to put together, something in the range of like 700 to 1,000 guns that could hypothetically, if they're placed on the point on the demilitarized zone that's closest to Seoul, be able to hit the city. Now, of course, North Korea needs to spread some of these guns out across the entire 160-mile width of the peninsula in the event that there is a war, so they can cover their own bases.
It probably also can't just go nuts and fire everything it has at one shot, right?
Yeah, exactly. If it were to do that, it runs the risk of retaliation because, South Korea and the U.S. have artillery radar. So as soon as something's fired, it only takes a couple of seconds actually for this radar to roughly pinpoint the location and transmit that information to an artillery team in command of much more advanced artillery, by the way, and much newer and probably much better maintained to hit the North Korea artillery positions.
So in other words, every time you fire, you are opening yourself up to return fire that could leave you vulnerable for whatever conflict follows that initial salvo.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that is how you get this strategy called shoot and scoot, where basically a self-propelled artillery piece will fire a round or two if they can, and then try to relocate very quickly. Now, these bigger guns, like the 170 millimeter, can only fire about 2 rounds every 5 minutes. So the stationary tactics that everyone thinks of when they think of artillery barrages from like World War I don't really work anymore. You need to constantly be relocating your pieces or risk exposing them to counter artillery fire.
So North Korea probably can't turn Seoul into a sea of fire and claims of 1 million people dead in just a matter of days or sooner are probably exaggerated. But what kind of casualty estimates are we talking about here?
Yeah, we got some feedback from the RC, the reality check that we published on this, where people said, is this the point you're making, that there is no, or the risk is very limited to Seoul? And that's not exactly the case. When we analyze a state's interests, it's important to have a good idea of what's at stake, because that just focuses you a little bit more into the reality of the risk. And there are a couple of different strategies that North Korea could pursue if it decided to hit Seoul with artillery. One would be just a barrage against the civilian population and basically trying to kill as many people as possible. And there are a range of estimates, but sort of the most methodical that I've come across was from a report by the Nautilus Institute. And they estimate that if this were the case, and if North Korea did not target any military targets and only hit the civilian population, you might see 64,000 casualties or so in the first day, and maybe going up to 80,000. Those are serious numbers, right? That's
Right.
more people dead in a day than U.S. soldiers were killed throughout the Vietnam War. So just because we're trying to get a better sense of what the risk is does not mean that this risk does not exist. North Korea can still hit Seoul with a lot of guns, just not with 20,000 guns.
Yeah, so the issue then becomes, in terms, if we're asking, so how much is this risk a deterrent to South Korea willing to go to war or to support a U.S. operation? It's hard to say, because it could be lower if they decide to hold back their forces to defend Pyongyang or to defend against an invasion, or could it even be higher if there's technologies that we're not aware of, or let's say they figure out a way to attach a chemical or biological weapon to some of their artillery, then it jumps up quite a bit, right?
Yeah, of course. North Korea has a pretty large inventory of chemical weapons. There's reason to believe they have biological weapons as well, but those are somewhat more difficult to deliver. They face some of the same reentry issues with, anyways, they're somewhat more volatile to deliver compared to chemical weapons. But then you have to ask the question, is that sort of a barrage even really in North Korea's interest? It certainly makes sense from a deterrent standpoint, like, if you do this, this is a lever we can pull, and it's a really dangerous level. It's a lever, right? It can cause a lot of damage. But if a war were to actually break out, would it be in North Korea's interest to senselessly kill a bunch of civilians or try to take out as quickly as they could, before their own artillery was eliminated, some of South Korea's military installations? So that's a point that this paper from the Nautilus Institute investigates in a little greater depth and says, well, if they were to do this, and if they were to not target civilian populations and instead focus on military bases or different military infrastructure, what could the extent of the damage be then? And it's a much lower number. It's a little below 3,000 deaths. Most of them would be military. Still a serious risk that South Korea must consider. Now, there is a third strategy that George Friedman, our founder at Geopolitical Futures, pointed out when we were running through this analysis earlier this week, which is North Korea targets its artillery force not at civilian populations necessarily, but at infrastructure that supports those civilian populations. So, artillery is fairly accurate nowadays, at least close enough to be able to hit, a city block or something like that. And if North Korea wanted to, they could make certain areas of Seoul essentially uninhabitable. And the risk there would be the casualties resulting from, one, the attack, but also the mass evacuation that would have to occur afterwards.
Right. It's easy to inflict a lot of pain, regardless. Or maybe not easy, but the potential is there and North Korea does have some options to create the sense that if there is war, it's going to be painful.
Yeah, exactly. This still absolutely acts as a deterrent to South Korea. I mean, look at how they're acting. Look at how their imperatives have shaped the relationship with the United States. I mean, South Korea has, said before, you can't launch an attack without us. Now, whether or not the U.S. actually has the capability to, that's another question. But obviously, this is a scenario that South Korea wishes to avoid. And if you're interested in a little bit more detail on this, we published the RC this week on Wednesday. It was called South Korea and the Wisdom of War. You can check it out, and we try to lay out some of the detail of this analysis a little bit more and build it into the basically the gaming out of the outbreak of a conflict that we've done in prior reports.
Yeah, I mean, they're interesting questions, and the more in the weeds you get, the more factors, variables that you identify in figuring out how this crisis plays out, it gets really tough because we're trying to figure out what North Korea can do, what South Korea can do to stop them, what the U.S. can do hand in hand with South Korea to stop them, and then also how much the two government or the three governments are weighing each factor against each other.
There's a lot of complexities to this crisis. The risk of a conflict, should be taken seriously. And what we're trying to do is just understand exactly what that risk looks like. So with that, Philip, I'd like to say, thanks for the engaging conversation. To our listeners, thanks for listening. Be sure to check out some of our written work online, and we'll see you next time.
For more geopolitical insights from the team at Geopolitical Futures, sign up for our free weekly email newsletter using the link in the description.